Okay, in this series of lesson 5, we'll be talking about the evolution series, and we'll be looking at evolution of the business functions in two ways. We'll be looking at the evolution of supply chains, which is being covered in this series, and also evolution of procurement as a function. Now let us start with the supply chain. Basics first. We said a supply chain is basically looking at the holistic operations of the organization, both internally and externally. And we say the supply chain would typically look something like this. You have the focal firm. This is the firm which, if they make the slightest change in the supply chain, it affects the whole thing. That's what we call the focal firm or the nodal firm. Now, if we want to look at a firm like Nike, Nike is a focal firm because when they decided to outsource everything to other people, it affected or reshaped the whole supply chain that was supported by the firm. So Nike, as it were, is what we basically call, is basically what we call a nodal firm. Now, the other section of the supply chain is what we call the forward section, and here we have the upward section. This here is the supply side, and this here is the demand side. Now, if we think of it that way, then it makes sense to have supply here, supply here. It depends on the number of tiers that you will have on this section. This is a two-tier supply chain because you have supplier 1 and supplier 2. If you have a two-tier demand side, you have what you call a distributor, you have a retailer before you get to the customer. This is a two-tier demand section. Now, you can also have a three-tier demand section where you have third-party logistics as a supporting firm in this section over here. Now, if we're talking about evolution of supply chain, I want you to think of it this way. How many changes have occurred along this section, and this section, and this section, and how have they affected the performance of the firm? Now, I'll just list the main evolutions here. We had the first one. This is 1910, thereabout, to 1925. And this here is what we call the Ford supply chain. Then we had the Toyota supply chain, came around 1950 to 1960. This is the Toyota supply chain. Then you have the Dell supply chain, which came around 1995 to 2000. That's the Dell supply chain. These are the main revolutions that we have had, and they have reshaped everything that we know our supply chains to be. Now, I want you to think of it this way. The differences between these three supply chains over here is whether one is a pull supply chain or a push supply chain. I'll define. A pull supply chain waits for the customer orders to trigger activity all the way to this section. This is what you call a pull supply chain. In other words, wait for the customers to order, then once they order, production begins. And it's also called an MTO. This is a pull supply chain. A push supply chain is you produce, then you push the goods through marketing to the customer. Now, let's see. How did Ford supply chain do their thing? Now, Ford is basically in the vehicle manufacturing industry or the auto industry, and theirs was what we call a wholly integrated firm. It was an integrated supply chain. Now, what we mean by integrated supply chain is you have the forward section owned by Ford. You have the internal section owned by Ford. You have the backward section or the upward section owned by Ford. That's what we mean by an integrated supply chain. What this means is Ford owned the iron ore. Ford owned the iron ore mines. Ford owned the refinery of the ore. Ford owned the steel part of fabricating this. Ford owned the assembly of the vehicles. And Ford owned the distribution of the vehicles to the customer. This here is an integrated supply chain. Now, the facts of this whole system are as follows. The time it took to convert the iron ore into a finished car was 81 to 84 hours. Now, this seems to be fast, but in reality, it's very, very slow. Toyota can give you a car anything between 6 hours to 10 hours, depending on the supply chain that they're using or the production system that they're using. Now, the other problem that we had with the Ford supply chain of owning everything, it was a highly rigid system, very rigid. You could not make changes on any part of the supply chain without affecting the whole system. That is one of the problems that it had. Another problem was one of variety. When you're talking about the auto industry, variety is very, very important. So, Ford could give you any color as long as it was black. Ford could give you any make as long as it was the Ford Model T. So, in a way, it was a very rigid system, but it served its purpose. It did serve its purpose. Now, you go to the second revolution, which is the Toyota supply chain, and Toyota said, we are not going to own this section, neither are we going to own this section. We are only going to focus on the assembly. We outsource the distribution, then we outsource the supply section. But how they did it is different. They had what you call long-term relationship with suppliers, using what we call Keiretsu system. And in this system, what they did is they brought their key strategic suppliers closer to their factories so that they can implement a just-in-time system. In other words, goods move from the long-term supplier to the production system just when they are needed. Now, when relying with long-term relationship with suppliers, a problem arises. The first problem is one of complacency. And you will have suppliers, if you enter into very long-term contracts, suppliers will basically become complacent because they have the contract already. But one of the advantages of disintegrating the system was variety. It's only Toyota that can be able to do this. Take a Ranex and then turn it into an Alex. Take a Noah, turn it into a Voxy. Take any car, then come up with a sub-model of the same car. In other words, the engine, the chassis, and everything else is the same, but they are able to it's a very flexible system, as it was. So the variety aspect is one of the benefits of this. Now, to solve the problem of complacency, Dell said, we are going to destroy this whole supply chain, and this is how ours will look like. You have the supplier on this end, you will have us, Dell, then you will have the customer. Most of the people that heard about this proposal opposed it because they said it cannot work. You need distributors, you need retailers, you need a huge chain of suppliers on your back end. But Dell was trying to say this. You only need the customer to place the order with you so that production can begin on this end or orders can happen on this end. You do not need to incur heavy costs to be able to serve your customers. Now, this is a good system because what it did is it addressed the complacency here of the suppliers, and it worked this way. Dell was so radical in this approach, they even allowed suppliers to act as though they are Dell. In other words, OEM, original equipment manufacturer contracts. That means if Dell wanted to serve the China market, which is a very huge market, 1 billion plus people, they gave the suppliers in China the OEM contracts and the specifications of everything about their computers, and they allowed them to manufacture those computers and supply them as though they were Dell. Now, this system here meant that Dell is not incurring costs of production. In other words, it's the supplier who will incur that cost of production. A very advantageous system. The other thing is, this system allowed customers to customize their orders. Okay, that's weird. Let me get the right English. It was a highly customizable system. In other words, you have the following. You have the RAM, you have the disk, the hard disk, you have the monitor aspect, then you have, what else am I missing? Then you have the keyboard over here. So if you also have the motherboard. So if you felt that I want a 2 GB RAM system, you'll just go on their website, click on 2 GB. If you want 1 TB, you go click 1 TB. The monitor, the specifications that you want, the keyboard, what kind of a keyboard you want, and the motherboard, if you want a graphics card added to it, whatever cards that you need added to the motherboard were added. Then you finalize your order, then click send. This is a very different system from the computers we have today. The computers we have today are already manufactured, and you only choose within specific types of computers. You do not have options as a customer. So this system over here was highly customer oriented, and it is one of the reasons why Dell became so competitive in the market today. So if we were to look at supply chains, these are the key changes that we have seen. We have seen an integrated system, a disintegrated system, and a customizable system. These are the key changes. So if you have any questions, again, don't forget to post them or send them to my email. Thank you very much.